Good evening. I'm an indisciplined diplomat who has strayed into an area which is usually reserved for more brainy people. And my introduction to nuclear was purely accidental. I happened to be Joint Secretary UN Political in Ministry of External Affairs when Pokhran 2 nuclear test took place. So I should confess I had no idea, no knowledge of what was going to happen, but I was involved in every stage of subsequent firefighting. And the second was, of course, in a more civil atmosphere as ambassador to Bohemian Kingdom, Czech Republic, which had a strong nuclear industry. And before I start, I was associated in VIF there was a VIF task force on India's energy transition, and which was chaired by Dr. Kakolkar. I'm very grateful to him. I'm very grateful to Dr. Grover, who's sitting here, for his guidance, and other members of the task force, Mrs. Manju Gupta, Anil Kutti, who's not here, Dr. Kulkarni. So I'll touch on that, and of course to IIT Bombay, which helped us do the mathematical modeling. Now, before I go to the slide, let me just mention a few things about energy transition. There's a fundamental difference between what energy transition means for the developed countries, and incidentally China belongs to that category, and to developing countries. Developed countries have to diversify from fossil fuel to clean energy sources. Developing countries have to grow and diversify. India, for instance, has a per capita electricity consumption of which is 1/3 the international level. So if you cap it at the current level, you will have clean environment perhaps, but we will leave millions of people in perpetual poverty. So this twin requirement of grow and diversify, which developing countries have to face, entails much larger investment and time. Second is, the energy transition is taking place against a background of depleting carbon resources. Developed countries and China have not only exhausted 80% of the global budget, but they are eating into what remains at a much faster clip, because their per capita consumption is higher, and it will remain high in future also, despite the downward trajectory of EU and US. And China will keep on increasing its share. And today it is the biggest emitter, it accounts for something like 30% of the global carbon budget, and its share will increase by 2030, because EU and US have peaked their emissions, which are now on downward trajectory. China will peak only in 2030. Now, we have 4 or 5 key questions. The most important, and this is the time. How much time do we have for effecting this huge transition? India has chosen a relatively longer transition time to net zero, which is 2070 as against 2060 for China and 2050 for most of the developed countries. But the longer transition time is not enough to safeguard our interests, because according to UN reports, the existing carbon budget, assuming 1.5 degree temperature threshold, will run out in 12 years time. There's pressure coming from the other source, and that is the concept of peaking. India has not accepted peaking for rightful reasons, but we cannot remain an exception indefinitely. EU and US have already peaked their emissions. China has agreed to peaking in 2030. Once China peaks, maybe we have, and these are my personal views, maybe we have another 5 years. So we are looking at a very small window of about a decade. And during this period, we have to quickly ramp up our energy consumption in order to stake our claim to meager carbon budget remaining. After all, who has fixed the peaking levels for other countries? They have fixed them themselves based on their existing or then prevailing emission rates. So we have to build up our generation capacity fast in this short window, and this means going with the existing technologies. So my suggestion is very different, from we just heard about SMR. We have to, commercial licensing and production of SMR will take more than a decade, and perhaps longer when the costs come down. NewScale, which has just gone out of operation, the costs had gone up from $6.2 to $9.2 billion for a 106 megawatt SMR, and you compare it with $2 billion cost for our indigenous reactor, and you have a multiple of 20. So this is not going to be an answer for our immediate needs, and when I use the word immediate, I am looking at this 10 or 15 years window at the most. So we have to go with existing technologies, and that will mean making use of our 700 megawatt and 220 megawatt indigenous reactors. Modularization is a process of manufacturing. That's a secondary issue. But first we have to ramp up the capacity. Now the second issue is, what is the minimum electricity demand and what is the cheapest generation mix? As we move towards net zero, we have to decarbonize not just the power sector, but other sectors of the economy. Now, when we bring in mobility, industry, other sectors into electrification based on clean sources, the demand for electricity will go up. What is the minimum quantum of electricity needed? And what is the cheapest generation mix? For this, the VIF task force headed by Dr. Kakolkar, we asked IIT Bombay to do mathematical modeling for us. And though our task force included many of the very senior dignitaries of your fraternity, we gave them a technology agnostic choice. That is, we gave them 5 scenarios, ranging from, I'll show you in the next slides, ranging from the nuclear renewable high, R95N5, to nuclear high, which was R5N95, and with 3 intermediate scenarios, which included coal with CCS, because coal is something which we have in abundance and we can't immediately do away with. Now, what was the result of for this mathematical model, we asked IIT to convert 75% of energy into electricity. So we have subjected ourselves to much more stringent standards than IEA. IEA, for instance, has a model is based on converting 50% of energy into electricity. No country in the world, certainly not India, has sinks which can absorb 50% of emissions from fossil fuel. So we asked the IIT to convert 70% of energy into electricity, and we also gave them 2 options, that is of the balanced demand, 10% to be met by hydrogen, and the second variant was 25% of demand to be met by hydrogen in respect of hard to abate sectors. Now, what was the result? And you have to look at the bottom row, which gives the VIF figures. And this shows, look at the 4th column, that is, according to IIT's modeling, we will need 24,000 to 30,000 terawatt hour of electricity in 2070. Now, closest to us is the CEW, which is 24,000 terawatt hour. They have taken a slightly longer period. Most others, and you start from the top, they are around 3,400 terawatt hour. Now let me take up IEA. IEA, because it is considered the energy industry leader. They have suggested 3,400 terawatt hour by 2040. Now, timelines are different between the VIF model and IEA, so I'm not comparing them directly. What this brings, but look at what is there at the top. According to Niti Aayog, India's energy consumption in 2020 was 6,200 terawatt hour. So how come India's energy consumption 20 years down the line be half of the energy consumption in 2020, which was pandemic year when the economic activities had slowed down? So there's something fundamentally flawed with IEA's projection. Now let's assume that their projection relates only to the power sector. Now if that is the case, then you are not going to achieve net zero, because according to IEA itself, power sector accounts for only 45% of emissions in India, and India does not have sink to absorb 55% of emissions coming from fossil sources. So this should, I hope, make people think about the prescriptions being bandied around, and this actually goes back to an ambiguity built into the concept of net zero. There is no absolute figure given. It is a relative concept, that is the level at which your emissions and absorptions balance out. So you can do this balancing at a low level of industrialization. You will get clean environment, but you will get, this is a prescription for perpetual poverty for poor countries. Or if you allow some scope for growth, then you reach a very different figure, and that explains the difference. And I think our figures are much more credible. Now, this I have already explained. Now, the second part of the second question we asked IIT to attempt, which is the cheapest generation mix to reach this demand level. And I had explained earlier that they were given these 5 options, and the answer was nuclear was the cheapest. It at $11.2 trillion cumulative investment by 2070, as against $15.5 trillion in case of renewable high scenario. That is about 28% lower. Now, you are engineers and scientists, so you will know the answer, but just to explain the reason, because there's always this confusion. If you take LCOE methodology or plant load figures, then renewables appear cheaper, but as MIT study pointed out, that for the same generation level, you need 6 times higher installed capacity for renewable, which explains why the renewables are actually a more expensive option. Now, this is again from an MIT study. It's not part of VIF report. It preceded our report by some years, and it says that the generation costs increase over proportionately if only VRE is used in the generation mixed. And on the other hand, if the nuclear power is included, then the cost can be reduced to half. And the advantage, MIT did this, established this result on the basis of 2 case studies, one involving a nuclear power plant in US and the other China. And the study showed that the advantage would be more pronounced or the advantage of nuclear would be more pronounced in case of a developing country. This is just the left-hand graph is installed capacity, and the bar, on the extreme left is the renewable high bar, and it shows that you will need something like 25,000 gigawatt capacity by 2070. The same generation can be achieved by a much smaller capacity, which is around 6,500 gigawatt, which includes both nuclear and renewable. This is, I have explained, that is renewable high is $15.5 trillion and the nuclear high will be $11.2 trillion. Now, since we attempted this report, some fresh figures have come. A recent report by Central Electricity Authority, which was, again, it was Dr. Grover's guidance. This report shows that the cost of renewable electricity round the clock ranges from about 5 rupees per unit to 7.5 rupees per unit. And this is based on 6 hours of battery storage, and which is a minimal. Actually, you require much more. So if anything, this is understatement, but even this is much higher than the figures which we assumed in our study. And if you compare it with the normal tariff, which to consumers appear to be very low, 2 rupees, that would capture only 40% to 30% of the actual cost, which CEA has now brought out. Now, what the CEA study shows, these are, cost of generation. It does not include cost of transmission. And a McKinsey study has brought out that transmission costs will be the major part of the delivered cost of electricity by the end of the century. There are 3 components. One is the operational cost of renewables, which will come down as the renewables replace the fossil fuel. Second is the capex, which has to be recovered, which will remain high. And the third is the transmission cost, which will go up in case you depend mostly on the renewables. And illustration of this problem from US is that 1400 gigawatt of renewable capacity is lying without transmission lines. Actually, I checked the numbers. This was taken from Economist. Last week's Economist mentions the number has gone up to 2000 gigawatt. And recently, Government of India has sanctioned more than 2 lakh crores, which is about $30 billion for the grid. Now, since not much of thermal capacity addition is taking place, most of this is going into renewable power. So that adds to the cost, and it shows how expensive this option is. The third element which our study brought out is the land requirement. India has 2 lakh square kilometers of surplus land. If you take the first, I had mentioned there were 2 variants, 10% hydrogen and 25%, in addition to 75% of energy converted into electricity. With the lower variant of 10% hydrogen only, the renewable option will require 4 lakh square kilometer of land, more than double the surplus land available. Nuclear can be adjusted within this limit. If you increase the proportion of hydrogen and the demand to 25%, the land requirement goes up astronomically to 1.3 million square kilometers, about 7 times higher than the surplus land available. There's a caveat here, and the caveat is that the land which is surplus today will not be surplus in 2070 with increasing population and infrastructure. So actual situation is much more grim than this chart would seem to show. Challenges of hydrogen, cost, land, and competition from Gulf exporters, including Saudi Arabia and UAE. You need, for green hydrogen produced through renewable route, you need sun and land. We have sun, we don't have land. Saudi Arabia have both sun and land. So, and they have deep pockets. So it will not be possible to stand that kind of competition. At the existing rates, the cost of hydrogen produced in India through renewable route was about $4 per kg. If you take into account the revised tariff cost which CEA study has brought out, it will be above $5 per kg. So this is far removed from $1 per kg standard which people are talking about. We have a target of 5 million metric tons of green hydrogen to be produced by 2030. This will require about 100 to 125 gigawatt of electricity, which is roughly 2/3 of total renewable electricity capacity that we have. Or if you take the expanded capacity of 500 gigawatt by 2030, this will be still 20-25% of India's renewable capacity. Are we willing to set aside such a large chunk of our renewable electricity capacity for hydrogen production only? This again is something which you people will understand, that the nuclear route coupled with thermochemical processes will works out cheaper, because in case of the renewable route, first the water is split into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis, and then hydrogen is burned to produce electricity. So two-stage conversion means energy loss, which is avoided in case of splitting the water through thermochemical processes using high-temperature gas reactors, which reduces the demand for electricity, electrolysis, and reduces the demand for electricity. And this is the reason why some of the major economies are giving funds for R&D for development of high-temperature gas reactors. And this is what our recommendation to Government of India will be, is that these are not the kind of resources which DAE or NPCIL can generate internally. This is again just an example, that is nuclear power in conjunction with solar in our case could be used for desalination or for hydrogen production as well as feeding the grid. This is an example from California. And there they are trying to bring out that the nuclear hydrogen can be produced much more cheaply using nuclear power. Now, this I have already covered. Now, what are Europe's choices? Germany has outsourced this green hydrogen to Morocco. And perhaps, they have signed an MOU about 2 billion euro or something, because they don't have land. There's a French government report, RTE, their distribution company, and they have also said the same thing, they don't have land. French, of course, are going the nuclear route. European Investment Agency is going to invest $1.1 trillion in Africa. Why? For land. And we have the same constraint, but they have made a very different choice. The previous speakers have already touched upon. This is a positive thing, and we have already agreed, we already have a target of tripling our nuclear capacity in a much shorter time frame. In my opinion, we could have easily joined, and we can still join this pledge. There was a problem with the renewable pledge because there was a link to phasing down of fossil fuel. This nuclear pledge had no such external linkages. Now, whether we go the nuclear route or renewable route, the cost of electricity will go up. And this is what our study has brought out. In case of the nuclear route, the cost will double. In case of the renewable route, it will triple. And it is important to bring this into public domain because there are reports by many think tanks. I do not know what it is, simply ignorance or they have an agenda, which say that, once you have used carbon price to force out coal and replace it with renewable, the cost of electricity will come down because renewables do not cost anything. As I mentioned earlier, which has been very well brought out by McKinsey report, the cost of electricity has three components. The operational cost will certainly come down once the renewables have replaced coal. but the capex will still have to be recovered, and transmission costs will actually go up. So this is I don't know whether it's a misperception or something more being spread in order to persuade India to introduce the concept of carbon price, which will have an impact on both industry and the consumers. This we also did, though India has not accepted the concept of peaking. We asked IIT Bombay to do a modeling using 2050 as a peaking year. And what they have brought out is that even with the delayed peaking, India's emission in 2050 will be 6.8 tons per capita, which is lower than the Chinese emissions of more than 7 tons per capita today. And the Chinese emissions will go up by 2030 to about 8.9 tons per capita. So India's emissions at the peaking level, even if we take a delayed peaking, will be 1/3 lower than the Chinese emissions in 2030. Now, this study has also brought out another fallacy which is being spread in the media, that, the argument goes that any delay in accepting peaking will lead to stranded assets. Actually, the study has brought out it's the other way around. The compressed schedule will increase the transition costs by $1.6 trillion. And this is not simply a question of front-loading the cost. There's going to be an actual increase in cost because you will be prematurely retiring many of the generating assets which still have a life left. So, now, let me just recap. I started my talk pointing out that we have about a decade's window. Now, what does that mean? If we have diversified to clean energy, if any country has diversified to clean energy before peaking is irrelevant. You can keep on increasing or decreasing your generation as per your requirement. But we are not going to reach that level in 10 years. No country is going to reach. So the result will be that we'll be hit by a ceiling on emissions, which is a ceiling on industrialization. It will set the boundary conditions. And that is why I was saying that first 10 years of transition are most crucial. And this is a period where we need to quickly ramp up our generation capacity. And any phasing down of coal has to be matched with ramping up of nuclear, because these are the only two stable sources of stable baseload factor. SMR can come in, but that can come at a subsequent phase of the transition period. But more than anything else, I would urge, the most important thing is that we have to realize that the quantum of electricity needed, that's comparative slide which I showed, that has to be understood. We need much more energy because we are starting from a much lower point in our development trajectory. And second is, of course, the choice of the generation mix, which again is corroborated by land constraint. Renewable can be used for distributed energy. Now, the ramping up quickly means known technologies, which is PHW, RS 220 and 700 megawatt. Maybe implementation time can be compressed. Now, one couple of last points, and this is financing. It's very important to understand that no money is going to come from abroad. All this to talk about international financing, the emission standards have become progressively more stringent. The financing commitment by developed countries remains same, and this is also the case in G20. if you read G20 communique carefully, you will find India as G20 chair has pegged the financing requirements at $4 trillion per annum. The commitment made by developed countries, which come further down in the same document, remain the same $100 billion. There's a reference to MDB reforms, which is qualified with the caveat as per their statutes. So first their statutes will have to be changed. Now last year, this year only, a few months, I think in May, World Bank equity debt ratio was changed. The equity ratio was diluted from 20% to 19%, so that larger volumes of debt can be leveraged. That 1% reduction in the equity only yielded $5 billion. Now you compare that with the figures we are talking about. It's absolute peanuts. So if we have to be on our own, now this is not an argument for not doing anything. Climate change is an existential reality. We have to move, which means that we have to improve the health of DISCOMs. It's not possible to sustain the policy of freebies, and this requires a political consensus. I also agree with the previous speaker that there is a need to amend Atomic Energy Act. There is some movement possible, NTPC, like NTPC MOU, there can be other PSUs also. But I think a detailed exercise needs to be done, how much money that can release. And there, of course, have to be multiple NPCIs, at least 2. And that there's a link question. It's not simply finance, it's the trained manpower. And my recommendation will be, I think we had discussed it, Dr. Grover may recall, I think the retirement age of the nuclear establishment people has to be extended, because you can't create this manpower immediately. So we are looking at a very difficult and grim situation. Thank you.